The studio lights blazed as they always did during the taping of the Oprah Winfrey Show. Golden warmth cascaded across the familiar set, where millions of dreams had been shared, where hearts had been opened, and where America came to feel less alone. But on this particular Tuesday afternoon in Chicago, something was about to happen that would change everything. The cameras were positioned perfectly, the audience was energized, and the production crew moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Everything was exactly as it should be, until it wasn't. Timothy Rodriguez sat quietly in his wheelchair in the third row, his small hands clutching a worn piece of paper so tightly his knuckles had turned white. At 12 years old, he had the kind of serious eyes that suggested he'd seen more of life's harsh realities than most adults. His dark brown hair was neatly combed, parted to one side just the way his mother used to do it every morning before school. He wore his best clothes, a red hoodie that still smelled faintly of the lavender detergent his grandmother used, blue jeans that had been carefully pressed that morning, and white sneakers that Maria Rodriguez had saved for 3 months to buy. They were slightly too big, purchased with the hope that he would grow into them. But Timothy didn't mind. They were the nicest shoes he'd ever owned. The show was proceeding as usual. Oprah moved gracefully across the stage in her elegant burgundy dress, the fabric flowing around her like liquid silk, her signature warmth radiating toward the audience as she interviewed Dr. Margaret Chen, a best-selling author whose new book explored the psychology of overcoming adversity. The conversation was engaging, filled with moments of insight and inspiration that had the audience leaning forward in their seats. Chen spoke about resilience, about the human capacity to find hope in the darkest circumstances, about how sometimes our greatest struggles become our greatest strengths. The audience laughed at appropriate moments, gasped when moved, and applauded when inspired. Mrs. Patterson, from Detroit, nodded knowingly when Dr. Chen talked about single mothers raising children against all odds. Mr. Williams, from Atlanta, wiped his eyes when the conversation turned to the loss of dreams and the courage to build new ones. Everything was perfectly orchestrated, exactly as it should be. But Timothy wasn't paying attention to the interview. His eyes remained fixed on that crumpled piece of paper in his lap, his fingers tracing the edges where his mother's pen had pressed deep into the paper. He couldn't read the words, but he had memorized every curve, every line, every smudge. The paper had traveled with him for 8 months now, since the day before his mother died, when she had pressed it into his hands with shaking fingers and whispered, "When you're ready, find someone who can read this to you, someone who understands." His grandmother, Maria Rodriguez, sat beside him, her weathered hands folded in her lap, occasionally glancing at her grandson with a mixture of pride and worry. At 68, Maria had raised 5 children of her own and thought her days of worrying about little ones were behind her. But when her daughter Isabella died of cancer at 32, leaving Timothy in her care, Maria discovered that a grandmother's love knows no bounds and no age limits. She had driven 8 hours from their small town in New Mexico to bring Timothy here, her old Ford pickup truck loaded with everything they might need for the 3-day trip. She had spent her entire month's savings on gas and hotel money, money that should have gone toward Timothy's medical equipment. But this trip felt important in a way she couldn't explain. Timothy had been carrying that letter for months, and something told her that this moment, this place, was where it needed to be read. During a commercial break, Oprah walked into the audience as she often did, connecting with people, making small talk, ensuring everyone felt welcome in her television home. She moved with the practiced ease of someone who had done this thousands of times, her warm smile never faltering as she shook hands and exchanged brief pleasantries. She complimented Mrs. Johnson's beautiful scarf, asked Mr. Thompson about his recovery from surgery, and listened intently as Mrs. Garcia shared a quick story about her grandson's recent graduation. She was working her way down the third row when she noticed Timothy. Something about his stillness caught her attention. While everyone around him was chatting and laughing during the break, sharing stories and taking selfies, he sat motionless, staring at that piece of paper with an intensity that seemed to pull all the energy from the space around him. His grandmother was speaking quietly to the woman beside her, explaining that this was Timothy's first trip to Chicago, his first time on an airplane, his first time in a television studio. But Timothy seemed oblivious to the conversation, lost in whatever world that letter contained. Oprah paused. In her years of hosting, she had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when someone needed to be seen, really seen. It was a skill born from her own childhood experiences, of feeling invisible, of carrying secrets too heavy for small shoulders. There was something about this boy that made her forget about the cameras, the schedule, the carefully planned segments still to come. "Hi there," she said softly, kneeling beside his wheelchair so they were at eye level. The burgundy fabric of her dress pooled around her as she settled into position. "I'm Oprah." Timothy looked up, and when their eyes met, she saw something that stopped her breath. Pain. Deep, adult pain that no 12-year-old should ever have to carry. But there was something else too, a quiet dignity, a strength that seemed to radiate from somewhere deep inside him. "I know," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the studio's ambient noise. "My mama used to watch you every day. She said you were the kind of person who sees people." The simple honesty of his words hit Oprah in a place she wasn't expecting. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Timothy." "Timothy Rodriguez. That's a strong name. Are you enjoying the show?" Timothy nodded, but his attention drifted back to the paper in his hands. Oprah noticed how his fingers trembled slightly as he held it, how he seemed to be trying to read something that remained just beyond his understanding. "What do you have there?" she asked gently. Timothy's grandmother leaned forward. "It's nothing, Miss Winfrey. Just something his mother—" She stopped herself, her own eyes filling with tears that she quickly wiped away with a tissue from her purse. But Timothy spoke before she could finish. "It's from my mama," he said, his voice gaining strength. "She wrote it before she went to heaven. She said someone would help me read it when I was ready." The commercial break was ending. Producers were signaling for Oprah to return to her mark. The next segment was ready to begin. A cooking demonstration that would showcase healthy recipes for busy families. The set was prepared, the chef was waiting, and millions of viewers were expecting entertainment. But Oprah didn't move. Something in Timothy's voice, in the careful way he held that piece of paper, told her this moment was more important than any television show. "Can you tell me what it says?" she asked. Timothy's face crumpled. "I can't read it." 4 words that hit Oprah like a physical blow. She looked at the paper more closely now and saw the careful handwriting of a mother who had taken time to write something important. The letters were formed with obvious care, as if Isabella Rodriguez had known this might be one of the last things she would ever give her son. She saw the tear stains that had dried on the edges, creating small watermarks that told their own story of grief. She saw how the paper had been folded and unfolded so many times it was beginning to tear at the creases. Behind them, the stage manager was making increasingly urgent gestures. The audience was settling back into their seats. The cameras were about to roll. The cooking segment needed to begin exactly on schedule to accommodate the satellite feed to the West Coast. But Oprah made a decision that would define this moment forever. She stood up and walked to the nearest producer, a young woman named Sarah, who had been with the show for 5 years and had never seen Oprah break protocol like this. "I need 5 minutes," she said firmly. "Don't start the cameras." "But Oprah, we're behind schedule, and the chef is ready." "In 5 minutes," she repeated. And there was something in her voice that made it clear this wasn't a request. It was a decision made from a place so deep and certain that questioning it would be like questioning gravity. She returned to Timothy, and this time, she didn't kneel. She sat down on the floor beside his wheelchair, right there in the middle of the audience, her elegant dress spreading around her like she was settling in for a long conversation. The audience members nearby looked on in surprise, but something in Oprah's demeanor told them this was a moment to witness, not interrupt. "Timothy," she said, "would you like me to read it to you?" His eyes widened. He looked at his grandmother, who nodded through her tears, then back at Oprah, slowly, carefully, as if he were handling something made of glass. He placed the letter in her hands. The studio had fallen, unusually quiet. Other audience members had begun to notice that something significant was happening. Even the crew members had stopped their preparations to watch. The usual bustle of a television studio during commercial break, the adjustment of lights, the movement of cameras, the whispered conversations between producers, all of it ceased. Oprah unfolded the letter with the reverence of someone handling a sacred text. The handwriting was feminine and careful, the words chosen with the precision of someone who knew these might be among the last she would ever write. To her son, as she began to read silently, her expression changed. Her professional composure wavered. Her breath caught. And then, without consulting anyone, without asking permission, she stood up and walked to the center of the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced to the confused audience, "we're going to do something different today." The studio fell completely silent. Cameras weren't rolling, but somehow everyone understood they were witnessing something that transcended television. The cooking demonstration was forgotten. The schedule was abandoned. In this moment, nothing mattered except a 12-year-old boy and the letter his mother had left him. "Timothy," Oprah called out, "would you like to come up here with me?" His grandmother started to protest. Timothy was shy. He didn't like attention. He would be embarrassed. But Timothy was already reaching for the controls of his wheelchair. With determination that seemed to surprise even him, he maneuvered his way through the narrow aisle and toward the stage. Audience members moved aside to create a clear path, and more than one person reached out to gently touch his shoulder as he passed, offering silent support. Oprah helped position his wheelchair center stage, then brought her own chair over and sat down beside him. She still held his mother's letter, and now, under the bright lights, with hundreds of eyes watching, she began to read aloud. "My dearest Timothy," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the studio's sound system. "If someone is reading this to you, it means I couldn't teach you myself, and I'm so sorry." The words hung in the air like a prayer. Audience members, who moments before had been checking their phones or chatting with neighbors, now sat in rapt attention. "I want you to know that not being able to read doesn't make you any less smart, any less important, or any less loved. I had to leave school when I was young to take care of my own mama, and I never learned to read well enough to teach you. But I always dreamed that someday someone would help you learn." Oprah's voice began to thicken with emotion, but she continued, "I've been saving money in a jar under my bed. There's not much, but it's for your education. I want you to learn to read, Timothy. I want you to read books and newspapers and anything else you want to read. I want you to have all the opportunities I never had." By now, there wasn't a dry eye in the studio. Grown men were wiping their faces. Women were openly sobbing. The crew members had stopped pretending to work and were listening with the same intensity as everyone else. Most importantly, I want you to know that being different doesn't make you broken. You see the world in ways other people don't. You feel things deeply. You notice things others miss. These are gifts, not problems. Oprah paused, looking directly at Timothy. His face was streaked with tears, but he was listening to every word with an intensity that suggested he was hearing his mother's voice for the first time since she died. "The reason I'm writing this letter is because I know someday you'll meet someone who will help you learn to read. When that day comes, I want them to know that you are the bravest, kindest, most loving boy in the world. You took care of me when I was sick. You never complained, even when I couldn't afford the things other kids had. You have a heart bigger than any person I've ever known. Oprah's voice broke completely. She looked up at the audience, then back at Timothy, and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Timothy, she said, setting the letter aside and reaching for his hands. Your mama was right, and I want to be the person who helps you learn to read. The audience erupted in applause, but Oprah wasn't finished. I want to do more than that. I want to make sure you get the education your mother dreamed of for you. I want to make sure that jar of money she saved becomes the foundation for a future she knew you deserved. She stood up and addressed the audience directly. Timothy's story isn't unique. There are thousands of children who can't read, not because they're not smart enough, but because they haven't had the opportunities or support they need. Today, we're going to change that. She turned back to Timothy. Your mother's letter doesn't end with sadness. It ends with hope. And that hope is sitting right here on this stage. Timothy wiped his eyes and looked up at her. Will you really teach me? I'll do better than that, Oprah said. I'm going to make sure you have the best teachers, the best resources, and all the support you need. And I'm going to read every single word of your mother's letter with you until you can read it yourself. She knelt down beside his wheelchair and spoke directly to him, her voice carrying such conviction that everyone in the studio felt it in their bones. Your mother saved that money because she believed in your future. She wrote this letter because she knew someone would care enough to help you. She was right on both counts. The cameras finally began to roll, but by then it didn't matter. What was happening on that stage had moved far beyond television. It had become something more important, something that would ripple outward and touch lives in ways no one could predict. 6 months later, Timothy could read his mother's letter himself. A year later, he was reading at grade level. 2 years later, he wrote his own letter to Oprah, thanking her for seeing him when he felt invisible, for hearing his mother's voice when she could no longer speak. The transformation didn't happen overnight. In the weeks following that remarkable afternoon, Oprah personally arranged for Timothy to work with Dr. Sarah Mitchell, one of the country's leading literacy specialists. Dr. Mitchell understood that Timothy's learning differences weren't deficits. They were simply different pathways to the same destination. She worked with him 3 times a week, using techniques specifically designed for visual learners like him. Timothy's first breakthrough came 6 weeks later, when he successfully read his first complete sentence. The boy loves his mother. It was from a simple reader, nothing fancy. But when Timothy read those 5 words aloud without help, Maria Rodriguez cried tears of joy that had been building for 12 years. The second breakthrough came 3 months later, when Timothy read a get well card that a fan had sent to him. The show had received thousands of letters after that episode aired, but this one was special because it was written by another child who couldn't read until she was 11. Dear Timothy, it said, my name is Sarah, and I want you to know you're not alone. Reading is hard, but you can do it. You're brave. Timothy read every word himself, slowly but surely, and when he finished, he asked his grandmother to help him write back. But perhaps the most meaningful breakthrough came exactly 1 year after that life-changing afternoon, when Timothy sat at the kitchen table in their small house in New Mexico, and for the first time, read his mother's letter without any help. He read it slowly, carefully, savoring each word that Isabella had written for him. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the special box where he kept it, next to the photo of him and Oprah on stage that day. Mama, he whispered to the photo of Isabella that sat on the windowsill. I can read your words now, and I understand everything you wanted to tell me. Maria watched from the doorway, marveling at how much her grandson had grown, not just in his reading ability, but in his confidence, his sense of possibility, his belief in himself. The shy, quiet boy who had clutched that letter in the television studio had become a young man who spoke up in class, who helped other struggling readers at school, who carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who knows they are valued. The scholarship fund that Oprah established in Isabella's name had grown beyond anything anyone had imagined. Donations poured in from viewers who had been moved by Timothy's story, from celebrities who wanted to support literacy programs, from corporations who understood that education changes lives. Within 2 years, the Isabella Rodriguez Reading Foundation was helping over 100 children across the country learn to read. Timothy became the foundation's youngest spokesperson, traveling to schools and literacy events to share his story. He would stand before audiences, sometimes small groups in elementary school libraries, sometimes large crowds at education conferences, and tell them about the letter his mother wrote, about the day he met Oprah, about the moment he realized that being different didn't make him broken. "My mama couldn't read very well," he would say, his voice clear and strong, "but she was the smartest person I knew. She understood that love doesn't need words to be powerful. She knew that sometimes the most important lessons come not from books, but from the heart." Dr. Mitchell often marveled at Timothy's progress, but more than that, she was amazed by his character. Many children who struggle with learning differences develop shame or anger about their challenges. Timothy seemed to have turned his struggles into compassion for others who faced similar obstacles. At 14, Timothy was reading above grade level and had become a mentor to younger children in his school's literacy program. At 15, he won a statewide essay contest with a piece titled "The Letter That Changed Everything," in which he wrote about the power of believing in yourself, even when others don't see your potential. At 16, Timothy received a full scholarship to attend a prestigious preparatory school, funded by the foundation that bore his mother's name. The night before he left for school, he sat in his old room, packing his belongings, when he came across the original letter his mother had written. The paper was more fragile now, the folds deeper, but every word was still clearly visible. He read it one more time, and as he did, he realized something profound. His mother's letter hadn't just been about learning to read. It had been about learning to believe in the possibility of transformation, about understanding that our circumstances don't define our destiny, about recognizing that love has the power to transcend even death. "Thank you, Mama," he whispered, "for believing in me before I could believe in myself." The next morning, as Timothy boarded the plane that would take him to his new school, he carried with him not just his mother's letter, but also a new letter, one he had written himself. It was addressed to a boy named Marcus, an 8-year-old who had recently been featured on a literacy program, a child who reminded Timothy of himself just a few years earlier. "Dear Marcus," the letter began, "my name is Timothy, and I want you to know that you're not alone. Learning to read is hard, but you can do it. You're brave, and sometimes, when you're feeling scared or frustrated, remember that somewhere out there is someone who believes in you, even if you can't see them yet. That someone might be a teacher, or a friend, or even a lady on television, who understands that the most important moments happen when we stop pretending everything is perfect and start paying attention to what's real." The letter continued for 2 pages, filled with encouragement, practical advice, and the kind of hope that can only come from someone who has walked a similar path. At the bottom, Timothy signed his name in the careful handwriting that Dr. Mitchell had helped him develop, and below that, he added a postscript. "P.S. My mama used to say that love is the only thing that gets bigger when you give it away. I'm giving some to you." When Marcus received that letter, 3 days later, he read it with the help of his reading tutor. But more importantly, He felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, the belief that his story, like Timothy's, might have a different ending than he had imagined. And Oprah, who had built a career on helping people find their best selves, realized she had just found something she didn't even know she was looking for. A purpose that went beyond entertainment, beyond inspiration, beyond anything she had ever done before. She had discovered that sometimes the most profound impact we can have is simply to pay attention, to listen, to see the person behind the struggle, and to believe in their potential, even when they can't believe in it themselves. The episode featuring Timothy aired during prime time, and it became one of the most watched shows in the program's history. But more than that, it sparked a national conversation about literacy, about the children who fall through the cracks of the education system, about the power of seeing and believing in every child's potential. Schools across the country began implementing new programs for children with learning differences. Libraries started offering family literacy programs that brought parents and children together to learn side by side. And perhaps most importantly, people began to understand that struggling to read doesn't mean lacking intelligence. It simply means needing a different kind of support. The legacy of that Tuesday afternoon in Chicago continued to ripple outward in ways that no one could have predicted. Teachers were inspired to look more closely at the quiet children in their classrooms. Parents were encouraged to seek help for children who were struggling, and children who felt different, who felt broken, who carried secrets about their learning challenges, began to believe that their stories might have different endings than they had imagined. In that moment, under those bright lights, surrounded by the warmth of human connection, a television studio became a classroom, a stage became an altar, and a letter from a dying mother became the first page of a story that was just beginning to be written. The show went on, but it was forever changed, and so was everyone who witnessed the moment when entertainment stopped and real life, real love, and real hope took center stage. Because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply to stop, to listen, to see, and to believe in the possibility that every ending can become a new beginning. That Tuesday afternoon proved that television, at its very best, has the power to transform not just viewers, but the very people who create it. Sometimes magic happens when we least expect it, in ordinary moments of life,